Good afternoon. If Daniel's talk was about psychedelics, mine is a bit of a downer because it's about how the mainstream media tells stories about art today. And here's a story that wrote itself. Last year, Pace's gallery in Beijing presented an exhibition of portraits of the fashion designer Diane von Furstenberg by artists like Andy Warhol and Chuck Close, along with commissions by new Chinese artists. Everyone wanted to cover this, from the New York Times to Vogue. And why not? It had all of the elements to appeal to today's mainstream audience: fashion, China, brand name artists. I handle public relations for an international gallery, working to tell the stories of 70 diverse artists. And from where I stand, I'm exposed to a lot of shifts in the art media landscape. And in the past 5 years, there's a paradox that has emerged. On one hand, there's been this dramatic expansion in the art world. The global marketplace has never been bigger. Fairs and biennials proliferate, and industries from fashion to technology want an association with contemporary art. But on the other hand, there's been a contraction in traditional arts coverage. The space for reviews and in-depth profiles has shrunk, and as we know, many critics have been let go from mainstream print publications. Believe it or not, today the Washington Post doesn't have a dedicated visual art critic. But at the same time, there's been an explosion of popular interest in contemporary art. And as prices skyrocket and artists become rock stars, everybody from 60 Minutes to Elle magazine wants a piece of the action. In some ways, the landscape is wider than it's ever been. Now, just to be clear, when I'm talking about this new landscape, I'm still talking about old media, traditional, prestigious outlets, even if they're accessed online. For now, at least, we've found that these established venues, like the Financial Times or the New Yorker or W, these venues remain the most important to a blue chip gallery's audiences, to collectors, but even to artists. So, Damien Hirst's collaboration with Louis Vuitton, or Kanye West's use of a George Condo painting on his album cover. These stories get instant attention, and lots of it, across a wide range of mainstream media outlets. And this is today's arts coverage. It's more popular and less critical. It's designed for a broad audience, and it's drawn to more glittery, accessible stories. So here's the challenge. How do we tell the quieter, but no less interesting or important stories about artists and their practices within this new context? An example, Thomas Noskowski. He's a painter and the quintessential artist's artist. For the past 4 decades, Tom has worked within the same format to create these richly colored, small-scale abstract paintings. The work on the screen is only 28 inches wide in real life. His work is adored by critics and collectors alike, but it's thoughtful, quiet, nuanced art by a guy in his mid-60s. It's not hot, and it's not trendy. So how do we tell stories like these within the new context? It wasn't until I prepared for this talk that I realized that there's actually a coherent approach that holds from artist to artist and exhibition to exhibition. And here's how I see it. Start in the studio, stay social, and share the story. So what does that mean? Start in the studio. Find the story behind the art. This comes from having in-depth conversations with artists. It's a process that begins months in advance with studio visits and talks where we draw out the backstories behind the work, the histories, the methods, even the mistakes. It's funny, sometimes there are elements that the artists themselves don't find noteworthy, but that an outside set of eyes finds fascinating, and which might provide the in for a great story. For instance, the Korean artist Lee Ufan works with organic matter, including large stone, for his minimalist meditative installations. He had a retrospective at the Guggenheim last summer, and it was cost prohibitive to ship his rocks from Asia to New York. So he went out to Long Island to pick his rocks. And the New York Times joined him on that field trip, which then provided a fun entry point for a story that nonetheless engaged seriously with his work and philosophy. The time in the studio is where we begin our immersion in an artist's work, and it continues with conversations with curators, by reading everything we can, and more often than not, developing an idiosyncratic new vocabulary, depending on how an artist likes his or her work to be described. We dig this deep so that we can serve as trusted proxies. Because in any industry that employs PR, a publicist is responsible for delivering a message. But I think that this has special significance in the arts because you're not just relaying a corporate strategy or a number of bullet points. You're entrusted with communicating a very specific and deeply personal creative vision. The second point is the easiest and the most obvious. Stay social. And I mean this in the old-fashioned way. Social like human interaction, not Twitter. The art world remains a uniquely social industry, which is perhaps what drew many of us to it in the first place. Openings, parties, biennials, benefits, fairs. These are the places where the international community of critics, curators, collectors, dealers, artists exchange ideas. They're also the places where I gather intel, tracking the movements and interests of writers and editors, and placing myself visibly and relentlessly on their radar screens. And it's this one-on-one interaction outside of the email inbox that turns communications into a two-way street. And it's where I establish myself as a resource for writers. So having these relationships is necessary, but it's no longer enough. It's how you match the right writer at the right outlet with the right story that results in the most valuable coverage. And that leads to the third point. Share the story. Embrace the opportunity for collaboration that today's new arts media landscape offers. Even if it means that a story won't be a straight profile of a single artist, there's the possibility to create something different and potentially more effective. I think of my job as reverse engineering the journalistic process, drawing out a narrative, which often comes from starting in the studio, identifying the ideal writer, often from staying social, and then being open and willing to collaborate with writers and editors on unconventional coverage. The artist Tara Donovan created these extraordinary paintings made out of pins, tens of thousands of steel pins, for her last exhibition at the gallery. Well, we knew that T, the New York Times style magazine, commissions an artist or a designer to create a version of their iconic logo for each issue of the mag. So we paired Tara with the editor and had her work together to create a version in the same style. So this is not a straightforward article about Tara and her show, but it's high-impact coverage that nonetheless draws positive attention to the work. Another example of the possibility that this collaborative landscape offers is something that Interview magazine actually pioneered decades ago, but that you see more and more frequently. And that's conversations that reach across disciplines. So an artist in dialogue with an architect or a chef or a designer revealing affinities and opening up a layered conversation, and literally sharing the story. Within the limited allocation of space for art stories today, it's not about grabbing a bigger piece of the pie for coverage. It's about baking your own pie. We need to make the space for art stories, even if that means encroaching on the pages of business, science, news, and yes, fashion. Before I close, I want to return to Tom Noskowski, the artist with the quiet paintings. For his most recent show at the gallery, we learned that Tom would be presenting small-scale abstract paintings. But we also learned that he would be pairing them with drawings. And he explained that these drawings weren't preparatory studies, but were actually cool-down exercises that he made after the fact, in which he explored roads not taken within a painting. And this was enough of a hook. We also knew about the New York Times' preference for image-driven stories that translate well to slideshows and other multimedia add-ons. So we pitched a conversation, having Tom describe the differences and the choices between a series of paintings and drawings. And it led to a full-page story in the Sunday Arts section, which was more coverage than Tom had ever received before. So, start in the studio, stay social, and share the story. And there's one more element that took a long time for me to learn, and that is to sometimes say no. Because even though one of the goals is press coverage, we have to be discriminating to make sure that the gallery, and most importantly, the artist, is comfortable with the context in which work is being presented. Because while art is being covered alongside luxury goods, it's not the same as a designer handbag. Art is transcendent. It exists beyond the marketplace, and it certainly exists beyond a magazine. And that's what my job is about, maintaining integrity while telling artist stories, big and small. Thank you.